Alex, question. Are you a safety first or a safety third kind of climber?
I think I'm probably more a safety first kind of climber than people might think. I think people maybe think of me as safety last, but I think I'm pretty close to safety first.
I don't think you're safety last. Maybe second.
Yeah, safety second. Is that a type of climber?
I don't know. Could be.
No, I think I'm pretty safe climber, except for when I choose to do things that are relatively unsafe.
I'm curious whether you think it's possible to ever be a totally 100% safe climber. Like for instance, anytime you open up a guidebook or you buy a new piece of gear, there's always a warning label that says climbing is an inherently dangerous activity, etc.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, no, I think it's basically possible to be a safe climber. It just depends. I mean, climbing is so broad. It's true that there is inherent risk in climbing, but I think it's easy to go an entire lifetime as a climber without having any serious accidents.
Yeah. So this week on the Roundtable, we're going to tackle safety. And what does that word even mean? Is it possible to be a climber and be safe? Alex, who's going to join us for this week's Roundtable?
This week we have Pete Takeda, who is the editor of Accidents in North American Climbing. He's also a lifelong climber who's done a little bit of everything throughout his I hate to call him old, but throughout his long career as a veteran outdoor rock climber, and he's really seen the sport change over the years.
Lisi and Lauren are going to join us from our team, so I think we're ready to dive in.
Let's start making shit up.
That's right. Okay.
Isn't that the essence of a roundtable? We just randomly just make shit up.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, Here we go.
This is Climbing Gold. Okay, well let's go then. So Pete, you want to just start with give us your basic bio?
Yeah, so I'm Pete Takeda. I've been climbing I added it up. I think I've been climbing for 42 years, and pretty much have climbed in every genre of climbing. And
you've climbed 42 years?
Yeah,
I thought you were only like 40.
No,
how old are you?
I'm so old. I only want to say. I'm in my late 50s. Yeah.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah.
You've been using a lot of sunscreen. You look great.
Yeah, it's just it's all the clean living. Remember when we first met in Waco tanks?
I don't remember Waco. Didn't we climb Lurking Fear together though?
No, we climbed. We did climb in the valley, but I remember that I first met Alex Honnold it was the Rock Ranch in Waco tanks, and that was the 2000s. And I think it was just prior to you soloing Moonlight Buttress, but I knew who you were already. I'm like, oh, this is the guy to watch. And you come in and you're like, oh, yeah, I just wanted to check out bouldering because I just wanted to see what it was like. And I remember handing you a bottle of whiskey, and I was like, do you see those 3 girls over there? You're like, yeah. I go, they're gonna go on a Moonlight bouldering thing. You should take this and go with them.
I do not remember. Are you sure you're thinking of the right person? So what happened?
Yeah, it was you, because I remember you're trying something like Loaded with Power the next day, and you're like something. You said something to the effect of, I didn't expect it, but bouldering's kind of hard.
Yeah, it is kind of hard. Yeah. But so did I take the whiskey? That then what happened? I'm like, what happened to the girls? What happened to the whiskey?
I don't know.
I don't think.
Like
did he send the boulder? Yeah.
You were so taken by the bouldering, I think we forgot to have that conversation. I'm sure you didn't drink it. Yeah. Plus, I was kind of drunk.
Well, I know I didn't drink it. I would definitely remember if I'd taken a bunch of whiskey and chased some ladies in Boulder. I know I didn't do that, but I'm like, but then what happened?
Yeah. I mean, when you walked in, you looked a little bit bored and maybe slightly disoriented. And me, having been embedded there for weeks, I figure I would point you in the right direction.
So give us your actual bio, though, besides being an instigator of trouble in the Waco Rock Ranch.
Yeah. So, I've been climbing for 40 plus years. I lived in Yosemite for 7 years. So that's kind of where I grew up and learned how to climb. And, I was around for the birth of sport climbing, the birth of indoor climbing, the birth of bolted mixed climbing, all that kind of thing. So been a participant in all these different genres at I think a decent level, not A, but maybe B plus over the years. And I think I've done like 15 Himalayan expeditions, been to Alaska a bunch. Cool. Yeah, I've been to, I think, Peru, like 15 expeditions. So
Jesus.
Yeah. And I'm kind of under the radar a little bit. Yeah, I just want to go climbing. That's my thing. And I'm also working on a book project. So I've written a couple of books, but I have a book project, and it's the history of American climbing from 1964, pretty much to the point that you solo El Cap, because to me that's kind of the end of like a relatable.
It's the end of history.
Well, it's not the end of history, but I think one has to have context to look back. But it's definitely this distinct bookmark in history. And I think past that point, things are still like coalescing and maturing and kind of getting into sharper focus and context. So yeah, so in exchange for me sitting on this, podcast, we have to do an interview sometime. So
that's fine. If I get to end your history book, I'm honored.
Yeah, it's like it's the last word in American climbing history. Yeah.
So Pete, you're obviously the editor of Accidents in North American Climbing. Lauren, you've helped as an editor as well. I've been in the book. Alex, I think you have too. Is that right?
I'm not sure.
I am sure. We double checked.
Oh, are you?
Yeah.
Which thing am I in?
You were, I think, in 2016. Would that have been right?
Oh, I wrote up when Sonny dropped me at Index. Totally. I remember that. That's kind of embarrassing. Yeah. So yeah, I have been in it kind of recently.
Yeah.
Yep. I forgot that I wrote that up.
Has anyone else appeared in it? Actually, like, besides editing it? No, only Alex and I.
I mean, I look back, I should have been in there a bunch, but I kind of escaped on my own power and never talked about it. So, yeah. Like it shouldn't be embarrassing to be in it. We should look at it as what we're doing is sharing an accident, an experience, and through that, we're informing the general climbing public.
Well, that's why I wrote up my last accident in 2016. So it's kind of like it was an easy accident to occur, and it's kind of like, well, it makes sense to remind people that if you're not paying attention, you can totally botch things.
Yeah, what was the accident? Out of curiosity.
It was my now wife lowered me off the end of the rope by accident. It's just her lowering me off the end of the rope, but it wasn't really her fault because she had just started climbing and I was using a rope that was too short. And, basically I set everything. I set her up for failure. There was like no knot in the end of the rope. I was like, here we go, let's do this thing. And then it turns out the rope is too short. But it was kind of a confluence of a bunch of things where like right before I started to pitch, I switched to her parents' rope because I was like, oh, we can leave a top rope on it for them. And it turns out their rope was way shorter than my rope. And, it was like all those kinds of things that add up. And so I only fell like 15 feet and I got banged up, but it wasn't that serious. But, it was a sort of obvious and preventable. I mean, it's exactly the kind of accident that you read about in Accidents in North American Mountaineering. You're like, oh, what a botch.
Yeah, it's funny. Like an accident like that is like, it's the Swiss cheese effect. It's, a couple things line up and suddenly you have this hole you can put your finger through in a piece of cheese. So
yeah, no, that was exactly it. We were kind of like, oh, several things happened, and then as a result, I fell and got hurt. And you're like, well, that's why you write it up, so that people pay attention to all the different things.
Do you feel, Pete, like, is that the point of the book? Is that basically to kind of educate and...
Yeah, I think it is to educate. I think, because I remember reading Accidents in North American Mountaineering when I was just starting climbing. And, there's kind of this morbid interest I had as a teenager in, well, what happens to other people when they do this or do that? And that later grew into just an interest in, well, what are the factors that went into contributing to an accident? And this was especially as I grew more and more sophisticated with my climbing. We are here to, portray and report accidents, and in some cases provide advice or information that might be helpful. I think where there's a little bit of a gray line is, we don't have a prescription for, in other words, we don't prescribe a specific solution for a specific accident because there's so many things that go into any one given accident. And there's also no exact right way to do specific things. So,
but it is helpful the way you guys categorize the accidents, where at the end it always summarizes it with like, fall with poor gear and loose rock or whatever. It breaks it into categories where you're kind of like, these are the things that contributed to an accident. And I think I always really like that, where you're kind of like, these are the handful of things. I mean, it might not be prescriptive, where it's like, this is what you should do in the future exactly, but it does break them into categories that help you identify which factors cause which accidents.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for saying that. And so I think what it does is it gives the user a chance to ponder and think about, well, what could have been done to prevent this, and what are perhaps the best practices. And we're trying to get people to educate themselves, because that's what it actually takes these days in climbing. And every so often I get an indignant email saying, you should have told this person to always use 3 points of contact or something like that. And I'm like, well, if we all use 3 points of contact, we would still be climbing 5-7. And so we have to
tell that to Chris Sharma.
Yeah. Chris,
like,
3
he's
points
using
of
1 point of contact.
Or
like,
no points. Yeah.
So, exactly. He's just flying between holds.
Yeah. So I think sometimes people wish there was a distinct singular prescription we could give as a solution, but that's not the business we're in. And I don't think that can be reflected in climbing, because climbing is so many things, as we all know.
That's the real value, I think, in reading Accidents in North American Mountaineering, is that you might want black and white answers, like always make this kind of anchor, always do whatever. But when you read the book, and especially when you read it over multiple seasons, you start to see that it's all gray area. Because I always personally broke it into categories of, this is a terrible thing that befell people versus these people made a terrible mistake. And of course, there's a bit of gray area in between that as well. But it's like, when you read enough of them, sometimes just terrible things happen, where like people are doing everything right and they just get hit by a rock that was like spontaneous rock fall, and then it's epic, but then sometimes you're like, what an idiot. I can't believe that person did that thing. Like, that is so bad. And then there's this huge spectrum in between. And I think that it gives you a sense, like, basically it just helps you with statistics, because otherwise you think of climbing accidents as only what you've heard happen to one of your friends, or you've like heard through the grapevine. But when you read the book enough, you realize that there's this huge array of things that can happen in climbing, and to some extent it is a numbers game. It's like, you just see that we're all numbers. I don't know. I've always really liked accidents in North American Mountaineering.
The thing we try to do is, we probably like look at maybe 300 accidents a year, like every single accident that gets sent in or reported in some way or another. And, we'll take like 100 of those and make it into these narratives. And, these narratives are these bite-sized little stories. Person XY, got together to go climb something or another. At the beginning of the day, they forgot to do one thing, and as they were climbing, this unfolded, and then there's a distinct ending to it. So I'd like to think of it as, I don't want to call it entertainment, but it is engaging. Like, there are these complete little stories. So, to your point, like, I used to sometimes read these things and I'd be all, oh my God, these people are such idiots. And I even, as I'm editing, sometimes have that feeling. But the lucky thing about being in this editorial position is I think back and I go, wait a minute, this person was a total idiot, but didn't you do that too? You just got away with it, Pete. So, it's really humbling in a way, because I get to think back and go, wow, like, yeah, I remember when I did that, I put in a crappy belay and my partner had to take, but quickly got back on the rock, and so didn't pull me off the cliff, stuff like that. So, yeah.
Yeah, and that's what I always thought was the coolest of like helping people write up their stories for the accidents book, or working with people through like their reports. And is that like primary cause and contributory causes list that Alex was talking about, that I think is so interesting, that provides that like reflection that you were talking about, Pete. Like, if you look at Alex's accident, it's like, well, the direct cause of the accident is that he was dropped off the end of the rope. But when you look at like the more important thing really is to look at all the contributing factors, like miscommunication and maybe rushing and maybe we're distracted and inexperienced and, all those things that you're like, oh, that's where you get like the big takeaway point. Like we all know that you're going to like fall to the ground if you get dropped off the end of the rope. That's not really where the learning is. It's like, well, why were you in that? Like why did that happen? Like, oh, switching of the rope, like all those details are the things that I feel like you're like, oh, okay. That's what I feel like where like a lot of the learning happens. And I love that like contributory list, of like, was I off route? Was I exceeding my abilities? Was it dark? Was I just like gripped out of my mind, and like not making very good decisions? Like those are all things, where it's like, or is there an incoming storm and we're like trying to move fast? Like those are the sort of things that actually cause accidents and like provide all that insight other than just like, oh, I fell and that's why I got hurt,
And, sometimes there's these small things that throw people off. It's like, and it causes them to lose attention. So in Alex's case, it's like, well, I switched over to my girlfriend's parents' rope. So something that takes you out of like your normal process and procedure, distracts you, and then, something happens. Because it seems to me that, it's almost the majority of accidents are due to inattention. Like the people already know how to do things right, but it's that moment of distraction that gravity's always there and it's always waiting to get you.
I always love the to what Lauren was saying, the sterile language in the reports. So it was like, failure of protection and off route and whatever. Basically just like a handful of little sterile, like, and then this thing happened. But you're like, the reality is some total freaking gummy is having the epic of their life and then botches it and gets hurt. And you're sort of like, it's summarized as poor decision making, late start, things like that. And you're sort of like, oh my God, what idiots. Like, I don't know.
That's why the best part of this whole book this year, Pete, I think is in this Cathedral Peak write-up. Maybe you guys saw this. It says, the climbers humbly said that they were, quote, incompetent, exhausted, ill-equipped, and cold. And it's like, normally you can't really like say that about people, but it like came from the climbers themselves. And I think it actually takes like a pretty introspective person to admit, like I was super out of my element and I never should have been up there. Because usually we try to be like, well, this happened and those are all reasons. But like at the end of the day, it takes a lot to be like, I was totally out of my depth,
Yeah, I think like for that person to make that quote unquote confession, that's the type of person who is really going to learn from their mistake. And also, like in some ways might last in climbing a really long time because they have that capacity to kind of go, well, this is the unvarnished truth of it.
We'll be back with more after the break.
Like when we say the word safe, everyone knows what that means. Like safe is safe. It's the absence of danger. And on one level, it's pretty objective, but it's, I think, kind of a fascinating thing because the moment you drill down into it, it becomes clear that safety, when it hits the real world, it's completely subjective, right? Like you think about it, not just in climbing of being like, well, we're being safe, right? When Alex says that, that might mean something very different from when I say it. And then you think about it like in terms of like people's lives and you're like, well, you could have a very safe life and sit on the couch all the time, but maybe that's actually not even that safe in the end too. Like, I guess like working on this book, do you feel like no one actually agrees what safe is? Like as someone who's sort of having to be like the moderator of that discussion, do you think there is actually one definition of safe?
I mean, that's a great question. And, the best I can answer that is, I think there's so many definitions of what is safe out there in the climbing world. For instance, I'll give you an example. A week ago, I was belaying my friend and his daughter was there. And his daughter is pretty much my adopted niece. And we get to go climbing together. So she's 9 years old. We're having a great time. And her dad is top roping and taking forever working these sections. So I just have him locked off on the gree and I'm chasing her around the gym. And sometimes both hands were not on the rope, I confess. And someone came up and goes, sir, we believe you know what you're doing, but you really have to keep one hand on the gree. So I guess that's a case in point of how there is a right way, a very safe way to do things. But based on our experience and the things that we have to do or do in the real world, sometimes we forget. And something like that is, I thought I was pretty safe. He wasn't going to hit the ground.
Well, the question too is well, when you say sometimes we forget, isn't the bigger issue when we're intentionally choosing not to do the thing that is supposed to be safe? It's like when you start to get slightly complacent, you get used to it, you're just, whatever, it's habit. I don't know. I was thinking, in sort of preparation for this chat, I was thinking about all the sort of official ways that you're supposed to climb and then all the ways that I climb now. Because like my aspiration nowadays is to reach the top of a cliff with no gear left on my harness and then just sit behind some rock and belay my partner up. Because if you wind up with a whole bunch of gear left over the top, you're sort of like, oh, why'd you carry it all the way into the mountains and all the way up the mountain? You're like, who cares? You should just like sit down on something and belay. But like, obviously that's not what's taught in any kind of book. But, it's kind of habit now and it works and it's great. And I don't know. It seems like the real safety issues are when you're choosing not to do the thing that is textbook, but you just can't be bothered.
I totally agree with that. There's like what actually gets done and what actually works, and then what the textbook is. And I was talking to Lauren the last time we were speaking in preparation for this interview, and I go, well, there's the front I have to put out there as the editor of this book, and then there's the things I know I have to do and do in order to climb the things I want to. And it's, there's so many different standards out there, to your point. Yeah, I just think being attentive and competent, like those are the two things one has to possess. And a lot of the accidents we see here is one, people being inattentive, or two, they're getting in situations where they're not competent.
Well, I think what's like interesting too, when you talk about the idea of textbook, is that the textbook like changes over time. Like I feel like if any of us now like went out to go sport climbing and I put you on belay with an ATC, while you're about to like lead your sport project, you'd be like, what the hell is that? Like that's not how we like do things anymore. But like for a really long time, it was totally acceptable to like climb with not a gree because they didn't exist. But now you'd be like, what? That's super sketch. I'm not doing that. And I think there's like textbook that changes over time. And I'm curious how you guys have noticed your idea of, both towards safety, but also like away from it, and the things that you're like, well, I've kind of like accepted this.
Yeah. Regarding using an ATC, and also having a gree, like I see quite a few accidents because people don't know how to use an ATC. They think it's only for rappelling. And yeah, you see these super complex, intricate scenarios unfold. And when you get right down to it, when I'm interviewing someone, I go, have you ever used an ATC? They go, oh no. And I'm like, well, you really should learn how to use that because you wouldn't be talking to me if you did. So
breaking the rules is one thing, but like not knowing the rules and then breaking the rules is like a really easy way to get into trouble. Breaking the rules, you can get into trouble too, but there is a level of kind of knowing, what's textbook and then being like, I'm conscientiously trying not to do that.
Yeah, you're saying there's a big difference between knowing the rules and intentionally breaking them versus having no idea what the rules are and just blundering your way into circumstances that you just could not foresee. Yeah, I think that's an important distinction, because I think that I know the rules pretty well, but sort of intentionally choose to break many of them. but I do think I do know them. I've read Freedom of the Hills, I've read all the books over the years. Like How to Rock Climb, all the classics. But now I just intentionally choose to ignore most of it. Actually, so it's funny at events over the years, I've probably had like a half dozen people ask me to sign their copy of Freedom of the Hills. People ask you to sign whatever. But whenever I sign Freedom of the Hills, I pretty much always sign, like this is great to a point, or like learn this so that you can ignore it, or random like variations of the theme. Whereas like this is a great thing for you to learn, but you should not apply it too wholeheartedly. It's like don't take this as dogma, because it's like a good foundation, but you don't need all of this. I think a great example of that is the modern prevalence of simulclimbing. Like sort of for high-end climbing, like simulclimbing now is not really a textbook, but it's just accepted, it's done, it's relatively safe, it's a normal strategy, but it's just not in the book.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I use that as I was preparing for this conversation. I was like, simulclimbing is such a good example of that, because if you are to Google anchors, best anchors, like there's a cajillion things come up of, all the different things you could be doing with your anchor management and all this stuff. But then if you actually, it's harder to actually find a solid system for simulclimbing, like a modern system for it. That's actually like, you got to go kind of deeper down into the Google results to even find that information, which is kind of wild. I mean, I don't think simulclimbing is like crazy prevalent, but it's certainly prevalent enough that you think
pretty common.
Yeah, it's pretty common. It's an advanced technique, but it was so interesting how that's like been one of those things that everyone's like, I don't know if we should encourage this or something, and they don't write about it.
The idea of simulclimbing being an advanced technique, I mean, there's so much content on other sorts of advanced techniques, like, how to do dead hangs on tiny edges for, X amount of time, blah, blah, blah. Like basically all the training material is like incredibly well documented. And, it's like on any Instagram page, you can find all kinds of like, max power endurance workouts, like make sure you do 7-3 and not 6-4 if you want to isolate whatever. And you're kind of like, that is so niche. It's like by comparison, simulclimbing is downright simple. You're like, oh, you just climb up the wall and you don't stop. It's just weird what type of content is heavily shared nowadays. It's kind of all indoor focused and like comp focused and not like safety and outdoor focused.
All that sort of simulclimbing information is on like the dark web, basically.
yeah, exactly. I mean, we do jokingly call it the dark arts. Yeah, it is the dark arts when you start getting into the weird stuff.
I mean, I wonder if that is partially because, with the training stuff, people are just relying on themselves. They're just going into the gym, they're cranking out reps. There's nothing else involved. With like simulclimbing, you're relying on your partner. You're trusting your partner, in a way that is just different than even multi-pitch climbing. And so I wonder if part of that is just that you have to find the right partner, and it takes a lot of trust to engage with someone on that level.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the indoor stuff is like it's more of a common genre, whereas anytime you're going to be simulclimbing, it's some sort of an adventure climb. And one paradox that occurs to me when we're talking about simulclimbing is, if you're in the mountains, it's safer to simulclimb or solo in many situations. So if you pitched something out and you're below a serac that you have to cross underneath, you're basically saying, here I am, shoot me, versus running across the gully, going fast and minimizing your time exposed to hazards. And I see this a lot too, where people say, well, this is how it should be done. And I'm like, well, that's how it should be done if there's certain parameters set. But one example I'll bring up is I got critiqued because I gave a slideshow and I was showing off-wit climbing and I wasn't wearing a helmet, and it's traditional climbing, therefore you should always wear a helmet. But, I know at least one case where someone had placed a piece of pro, they were wearing a helmet, they turned sideways, the helmet got stuck, he's trying to clip the gear clips to the helmet, and he's yelling, his partner thinks he needs to be on tension and starts pulling on the rope, and it's literally strangling him. And it's one of those things I could see if you took a whipper down a squeeze chimney and your helmet got stuck, it would break your neck. And you did everything right. You were wearing a helmet, but the helmet killed you. You can't make this shit up. It's like, I'll see it and I go, wow, like I could never have thought this up. Like Hollywood could never think up a scenario like this. So
I think that's why you just don't climb off-wits for fun. That's all a terrible story.
I mean, that's a good point.
It's terrible.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that there's this interesting like discussion in climbing, which I don't think is based on a scenario that happens that often, in which you're like in a position where you're at the crag and you're seeing someone do something that is like heinously sketchy, or maybe like moderately sketchy, and you have to decide like, am I going to go over to these strangers and like tell them, that they're doing something wrong, and like you're trying to make this thing. And I like have this idea of the safety police, like of being taken to extremes, of times when I feel like I or people that I know have been critiqued by significantly less experienced climbers for doing something that is potentially not textbook but totally valid. And like, for me, it comes back to this moment of, there's like ironies all over this story, but after Brad Gobright died, a bunch of us from Yosemite, including like pretty much the entire current Valley Search and Rescue team, went down to LA for a memorial for Brad at a climbing jam. everyone was like, well, we'll just go early and like climb a little bit before it starts, because there was the kind of this awkward situation where there's like a memorial happening in one corner of the gym and like people climbing actively in the rest of the gym. So we're like, oh, we'll just go early and climb. And basically we all have to take a belay test, because you have to take a belay test every time you go, to a new gym. And like the whole Yosemite Valley Search and Rescue team fails the belay test because of some proprietary rule that existed at this one, LA climbing gym. It's a really like high stress environment, and you've got like a teenage climbing gym employee, telling these like massively experienced, these people like definitely know like how to use a gree-gree, but they had some proprietary rule that's like, this is how you have to do it in this gym. And I just felt like there was all this irony in this moment of getting safety policed, of feeling like that, but also feeling that like anger at like, I know how to do this. Like, don't tell me, how to use a gree-gree, because I've been using a gree-gree longer than you've been climbing, sort of anger that started to like build up at this moment in the gym. And as like everyone is failing this test. And I don't know. And I just feel like, it always like reminds me of moments where like, obviously there's just a million different ways to do things. My guess is that you've all also had moments of having like awkward interactions with folks. I mean, Pete, you just talked about one that you had at the climbing gym too, of just being like having those confrontations with people, not over like things that are obviously dangerous, but like just differences in like ways that you've learned how to do things.
Have you guys ever safety policed someone? I'm like curious whether you actually have gone like have you ever seen something actually out, in the wild and sort of stop somebody or done like
I've steadily become a more outspoken safety policer over the years. Like, I mean, in particular in Yosemite, like on El Cap, like when we were doing the no speed record, let's say, every time we'd pass a party that's doing something sort of unorthodox or counterproductive, I would just tell them like, oh, you're hauling sort of wrong. Or like, and we've had a bunch of times where coming into the stove legs, I came up to a guy that didn't really speak much English, who was basically like holding a quick draw and about to just cut loose and take the swing of his life like into a corner. And I was like, you're gonna die. And we basically like grabbed him. It was like, no, don't. And then tried to like teach him how to do a lower out, because you can't just swing there, because you'll just hit this corner and probably break your legs. Or maybe he would have stuck it, but either way, it was like definitely not best practices.
Someone
and he
has
would have
broken
been
their
probably
leg
hurt.
doing in that exact spot.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like, and he was a big tough dude, like he was looking at it kind of like, oh, I don't know, it's the kind of thing where someone like sets up to take a swing and then they start to think about it more and they're like, oh no, I don't want to take this swing. But so definitely in circumstances like those, I'm way more outspoken now. I'm just like, look, it seems like you're botching. Like when do you go up to somebody and just tell them that they're botching it? Well, I don't know. I mean, my contention is that you should do that more often than you think you should. That it's probably better, especially if you're not douchey about it, but be like, have you thought about what will happen if this person falls? Or like, oh, hey, I noticed that you have 4 meters of slack out and your, partner's only 3 meters off the ground. I don't know, you can be tactful about it, but I feel like it's generally better to say something than to not say something.
But has anyone ever been like, hey, bro, I got it? I mean, probably not, because you're Alex Honnold, but I just feel like if I did that all the time, like as often as you did, I feel like I'd get more. Like, I'm afraid of the pushback. People being like, yeah, I freaking.
No,
yeah,
I rarely do this, honestly, because I don't like talking to strangers. But I mean, if you see something that's actually sketchy, I mean, it is kind of your obligation to say something. Also, the pushback, I mean, well, who cares? I think that, I mean, isn't the point to feel like you did the right thing? It's totally. Like just to say, it's like having integrity or whatever. You're sort of like, oh, you see, like if you saw someone about to step into traffic, like you would stop them. Because you're like, oh, that person's on their phone and they're about to step in front of a truck. You're like, whoa, I should do something. I feel like seeing somebody, load their gree-gree backward at the sport crag or something is kind of the same genre of mistake. Like you should just intervene if you see something that's like an accident waiting to happen.
I think there's more, it's like easy when someone's like fully botched it, right? Like the gree-gree is not loaded correctly and it's like a really high stakes. It's really easy. But then I feel like there's lots of those middle grounds of like, they kind of have a lot of slack out. It's not, or like just things where you're like, it's pretty borderline. And I feel like that's when it gets like harder, to feel like you're like, well, there are different ways of doing things and people interpret things differently. Like,
but don't you think that it's still better for somebody to bring it up and then to have the very brief conversation where you're like, oh, I appreciate, your input, I know that, and I prefer to do it this way for this reason, and it's all a totally adult conversation. It's chill. I mean, that's the thing, is it doesn't always have to be contentious. I mean, you can just tell somebody like, oh, I think that might be a little too much slack out for this particular situation. Like, no offense, just, want to make sure your partner doesn't get hurt. You're like, moving on. And if they choose to get offended by that, that's their choice. You know what I mean? Like, you can say something politely and respectfully, but still just have their best interest in mind.
I actually, several years ago, was climbing at an easy crag in Red Rock and saw someone belaying inappropriately and said to them, like, hey, maybe you should think about doing it this way. And they told me they were an AMGA guide and that I was wrong. And I was like, okay. And then about 10 seconds later, their partner fell and hit the ground. And there was a rescue that had to happen. And it was like just awful. I just remember thinking like, man, I said something and this still happened.
Yeah, but isn't that better than having not said something?
Yeah.
At least you don't have to second guess that way.
And I'm not saying that means we shouldn't say anything, but it just, I think it's hard too, because sometimes if, especially a female speaking to a male, like I was in this instance, like it can be a little tough sometimes to get the reception because people think that you don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, but I think that the thing to focus on is just doing the right thing, which in that case, you're like, well, you did your part, you did the right thing. You can at least sleep well at night knowing that you did the best you could. And, beyond that, you're kind of like, well, it was truly that person's fault. Like they really botched it,
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think I did the wrong thing. I think it's just more interesting that like that dynamic exists sometimes in this conversation that, people, you might approach someone and they might not trust you or hear what you have to say.
Yeah. Worse yet, they might, in defiance of your instruction or your advice, they might get even worse. I could see that happening too. There's a high level of indignation in the climbing world. You kind of, risk running into that, I guess.
But that shouldn't be a barrier for doing the right thing. It's like no matter how indignant somebody is or how upset somebody gets, that shouldn't stop you from doing what's right in a given situation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the way I think about it is like if my partner was doing something sketchy, I would want someone to say something to them if I was climbing, Yeah.
I actually have had plenty of, chastisements over the years, where random people are like, that's sketchy. What are you doing? And you're kind of like, oh, well, I'm choosing to do it this way for a reason. And I think it's fine. But, if something had happened in that particular instance, you'd be like, oh, yeah, no, they were totally right. That was sketchy. I don't know.
Yeah.
I remember I once climbed the third pillar of Dana in Tuolumne, like classic 510. And I got to the top and I was belaying a partner up. And somebody on the top was like ranting about how he hated people that had sketchy anchors and blah, blah, blah about like, I can't believe somebody would do that. And then kind of like looked over and I was belaying up a single #1 Camelot, the only piece I have left or whatever in this one block. But I was like, it's fine. We're sitting on top of the mountain, I felt very safe. But then the guy went off and like, you're the, blah, blah, blah about how it's totally unsafe. And I'm like, yeah, it's not best practices. And you wouldn't want to do this all the time, even though I kind of do that almost all the time. It's just hard to say. You're kind of like, yeah, but it's a choice. Like, I think this is okay.
Pete, you pointed out there's I think there's a couple terms you've used or phrases you've used, but the very consistent nature of gravity. Like if you look at the initial cause of every accident, it's like, oh, gravity. And then, then there's the context there. And when you come out into the real world, is there do you feel like there's any such thing as a safe climber?
I think the safest climber is the person who doesn't climb because, gravity is this constant force. Gravity is always waiting for you to drop your guard, and you can learn all the best processes and procedures. You can have all the right tools. You can have all the perfect techniques. You can be alert. You can be all these things. But I think what every climber, if they want to be called a climber, needs to understand that every time they start climbing, they're taking their life in their hands. And that's part of what makes climbing what it is. That's part of why we love climbing. We take that, it's kind of that responsibility and that alertness on, and we own that. And I think that the trouble is when, people might feel entitled to climb a certain grade, or they feel like they're without putting their due diligence in that they're capable of doing something, and they don't take the proper precaution or they cease to pay attention, that's where you see accidents happen. And I think if everyone, like when we went out there, said, wow, my life is on the line, my partner's life is on the line, then I think statistically climbing would get safer.
We'll be back with more after the break. To be fair, though, I mean, I think climbing is safer than many other sports, and even sort of mainstream sports like mountain biking or something. I think it's fair to say that, most climbers are rarely injured. I think that the important distinction with climbing versus other sports, though, is that injuries are often fatal or can be. That the stakes in climbing are really high. But climbing isn't that dangerous. I mean, we all have a lot of friends who have climbed for 40 years and never had any kind of injury.
Yeah, I would agree.
Except for tendon injuries where they're like, oh, my middle finger is a little strained because I was doing that mono move over and over. And you're kind of like, that is grossly different than people breaking their clavicle mountain biking like every other season.
Yeah, I think if we could get real good statistics on, user hours out there per climber, and came up with a sum total of that and then compared that against the accidents, I bet you climbing would be statistically an incredibly safe sport. And I think that's because if you're any distance above the ground, it's in our nature to be alert and to consider what the ramifications are. And I think, our fears play into that. It's like, wow, this is a spectacular position. I'm a bit anxious or afraid. I'm going to pay more attention. So
climbing's exploded, right? And in theory, this book has kind of always been about the same size. And obviously maybe you're selecting more, not doing duplicates of each accident. I feel like maybe climbing is becoming safer. People are actually becoming better at it. There's the reality of the fact that there's so many people climbing, and yet this hasn't turned into a 4-volume edition every year.
That's just because Pete's a good editor. He just throws most of them away. He's like, whatever, we already read this one.
Do you guys see more? Are there more reports coming in than there were 10 years ago or 20 years ago?
Yeah, I was looking back at the charts that record the number of accidents that get reported, and I would say that it has gone up in numbers. I think what you see published in the book is reflective of the page count we have to work with and how many accidents can we actually report.
But has it gone up per capita? Has it gone up per as a percentage of climbers? Because there's so many more climbers. Obviously, there are going to be more accidents.
Yeah.
But are there proportionally more accidents? That I kind of doubt, actually.
I don't know. We don't have a statistic on how many people actually climb or how many, days or hours those people actually climb. So it's hard to get data. But yeah, I would say for my gut, I'd say there's proportionally probably the same number of accidents. Yeah, there's just way more people climbing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's almost like an arms race. Gear has gotten so much better, hardware is safer, everything is kind of better in some ways, but then you have more random people who don't know how to use the gear, pushing the gear to its limits. And you're sort of like, oh, it's getting safer in some ways, it's getting sketchier in other ways, and it just balances out at about, same number of people having accidents.
Yeah, my gut says yes. I'd agree with that.
Yeah, I wonder too if it's something unique to climbing, the way that I feel like climbers love to think about accidents afterwards. Alex, you talked about that you pretty much always read the accidents book when it comes out. And I feel like, there's this unique thing in climbing where it feels really important as a climber to when there is an accident, especially a fatal one, to take some time to stop and analyze it, and do these write-ups. And I kind of wonder if it's just us trying to prevent ourselves from being in that exact same position in the future, or if there's something kind of unique about climbing that makes it so that we, I feel like when I hear that someone's in a climbing accident, my initial reaction is to really want to know exactly what happened. And I don't feel like that happens as much in other sports or even other aspects of life.
There is an industry that can compare though, and I think that's flying. Aviation is that way.
But the similarity is that they both are super rare
Yeah.
for accidents. And then when accidents happen, they're catastrophic. So I think you have to learn from other people's accidents. I think aviation is the perfect example because accidents are super, super rare. But when they happen, they're devastating. And then it's you kind of have to learn from any accident that occurs because you don't have that many other opportunities to learn. Like, it's not like you're going to make lots of small accidents on a daily basis.
Yeah.
It's like the big ones happen from time to time, and they're a big deal when they do.
Well, and it's also like a partnership. It's not a sport, but like sport in some ways, right? Where you have always two people flying an aircraft that's commercial anyways at all. And so there's like a lot of communication involved. And it's similar to climbing in that way, where it's like you have to analyze the exact things that happened in the communication, like where the communication breakdown was.
Do pilots start every flight with fly on, off flight, flight off when they land?
They have like there's like a 90, there's a list of like 90 things they have to like check off, before they fly.
Is it worth noting that your husband is a pilot? I feel like that probably hasn't been in many other episodes of this podcast. But
He's just like a super nerdy plane person. Yeah.
I actually know nothing about planes. Please don't ask me anything.
But you know a lot about pilots.
I do.
What was the question, Pete?
Like, Alex, have you ever had a sketchy moment free soloing where you're like, whoa, like I got to pull it together, or I'm in big trouble, or I'm really pumped and I better punch it?
Yeah. I've had tons of sketchy moments free soloing, but a lot of them are over before you know it. Like on Royal Arches once, I pulled a big rock off and then kind of shoved it back into place before I lost balance. And, it was like a big flake peeled back, and I was peeling back, and then I like put the flake back into place, and then sort of like caught my balance and was like, whoa. And so by the time you even realize what happened, the situation's already resolved. And I've had that with like breaking holds and other, I don't know, like I had both my footholds break off once, like down soling this like Choss Tower in Chad. And so you're just like dangling by these jugs. And I was kind of like, whoa. But, by the time you realize what happened, it's already happened. So it's like in the past. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of the nature of soling a lot, is you just get all kinds of weird situations. I would say actually soling is one thing where you do have to sort of learn it for yourself, because there aren't that many. It's not like there are a lot of soling. I mean, occasionally you see soling accidents in the report every year, but not really. And there isn't that much to learn from most soling accidents. I mean, you can a little bit, but for the most part, you have to live a lot of it.
Yeah, there's not a whole lot of teachable moments in these free solo accidents. The thing I do see is there's more and more, and we have been seeing it's the influence of, I think, the pursuit of social media that's coming into play with some of these free solo accidents, whether it's what people see on the internet or whether they're building a following. And, it's such a slippery thing to try to determine cause and effect, but it is a disturbing trend I see within, accidents. Because I just remember, free soloing when I was coming up in Yosemite. It's what you did. You kind of, it was just part of being a climber, just like going bouldering or climbing El Cap or jamming your hands in the crack. Free soloing was part of the game. But the mythology was always that no one is ever going to die free soloing, because, we're all so tuned in and we're making, some pretty strict judgments about what we will solo. And these days, I swear, some of the stuff that comes across my desk, I'm like, oh man, like, what are these people thinking? They're threshold free soloing and they're on-sighting, and sometimes it doesn't work out for them. And, I'm not passing judgment, but it's like, I think there's something of the self-preservation mechanism that I used to take for granted just isn't there all the time. So that's why I asked that question. I go, well,
Do you think that's true, that the self-preservation isn't there, or do you think that the drive for glory or whatever is just greater than the drive for self-preservation? I mean, there are plenty of stories of old timers who are sort of seeking glory in a way. I mean, some of the famous stories of like John Jablonski soloing, in Stonemaster times, are definitely in the same, obviously he wasn't a social media influencer, but it's like he was his generation's, sort of iconic influencer.
Yeah. He wanted to hold his head high in the parking lot, as we used to say.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I'd say that's true. And I say, I would say that, if one's desire for whatever that affirmation is exceeds one's judgment, then we're going to get these type of accidents. And I definitely have had my moments free soloing where it's like, whoa, you better get really good, because you got about 30 seconds to make up your mind what you're going to do. So, yeah.
And do you think there are more soloing accidents now than there used to be?
I think overall, yeah. But that once again might reflect the fact that more people are climbing.
Yeah. I actually kind of felt like there are fewer soloists than there used to be, which I don't know if that's true or not, but you definitely see fewer people casually free soloing, I think, than you did, 10 or 15 years ago. Like the kind of like casual after work 5/7 solos, like on easy multi-pitches and things, like you just don't really see that. And I mean, and I live, near Red Rock, which is really like soloing paradise for easy after work soloing. And you just do not see people on the easy routes here. Like I basically have never seen somebody out scrambling. And I mean, Yosemite, you see it a little bit just because there's like such a culture of it, but I still feel like it's maybe less than it used to be. But that might just be me being less in touch with the scene or something. Like, I don't know. But, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I would say accident-wise, definitely see a lot more free solo accidents. And I attribute that there's just way more climbers. But to your point, I was worried for a while that, we were trying to breed risk out of the sport. Like we're trying to eliminate it. And that was reflected in what I saw was the end of dirtbag culture, or the decline of dirtbag culture and the decline of free soloing. So I remember when I heard about you, I'm like, oh, thank God. Like someone is doing it, because to me, it was so intrinsically wrapped up into the identity of climbing.
But that's the interesting thing with a conversation about safety, is that as climbers, we celebrate selective risk taking, like taking the right risks and getting away with it. Is that right? Is it like, if we care about safety, we care about people staying safe, like, should we be celebrating risky behavior? And this isn't just specific to free soloing. I mean, think of like trad climbing in the UK and plenty of other places where climbing is inherently sketchy, and yet we celebrate the people who take the biggest risks. And it's like, should we be doing that? Like, are we encouraging more accidents? People ask me all the time, like, do I worry that the film Free Solo has inspired people to solo more? And in general, I say that I don't worry about that, because I don't know, I haven't really seen it. But if you're saying that there are more people having free soloing accidents, I'm kind of like, oh, that's sobering. That's obviously not the right thing.
Yeah, I think a question like that goes back to like our assessment of what climbing is. And I think climbing is a celebration of a risk. It's a celebration of a risk that we opt into and that we make a choice about. I mean, I think people should make qualified choices based on a level of experience and, a deep-seated desire to test themselves or to, learn more about themselves. So it does come down to what role does risk play in the way that we define climbing. Chenard said it really well. I interviewed him like a couple decades ago, but he was decrying, bouldering as not being a legitimate form of climbing because all climbing, to be climbing, requires risk. And then 10 minutes later, I asked him, well, have you ever had an injury, an accident? He goes, yeah. I go, what happened? He goes, I fell bouldering. So that was kind of this ironic statement that he made. But yeah.
I'm hung up on like, and so do we double down on that? Like, do we encourage people to take risk? I mean, is risk taking foundational to climbing?
I mean, I don't think we should encourage nor discourage it. I think we should support people in effecting what they wish to do. And I think that's it. I think that's the paradox about climbing, but it's also what we love about it. We have the choice to train really hard and try to climb 514. We have the choice to go out after work and free solo this 5/7. And I think if people really owned all their actions in climbing and also based their goals and their judgment and set their vision in accordance to the reality that they live, well, we might not have so many accidents. I don't know. Climbing requires risk, and it requires a choice, whether we like it or not, or we just should not climb.
Thanks, Pete, for chatting with us. Accidents in North American Climbing comes out every year as part of a membership with the American Alpine Club. That's how you get the book. Visit them at AmericanAlpineClub.org. Climbing Gold is a production of Duct Tape and Beer. Alex Honnold is our host. Today's show was produced by Marco Seiler Gonzalez and me, Fitz Cahall. Additional editing and mixing and mastering by Evan Phillips. Music by Brendan O'Connell. Our YouTube and social media editor is Skylar Perwins. Our executive producers are Jonathan Retzik and Ben Endy for RXR Sports, and Lacey Hendricks and Becca Cahall for Duct Tape and Beer. Thanks for listening.